conducted fieldwork in Egypt and Turkey and Mongolia, diaspora communities in the US and Europe, including also Afghan, Armenian, Cuban, Ghanaian, Iranian, Liberians, and Palestinian communities. So, may I?
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Nordic African Institute for sponsoring this very exciting conference. It's always a pleasure to have an exchange of ideas from across the pond. What I'm going to talk about today is a topic called diaspora homeland investment. As many of you know, most of the attention around diasporans' economic relationship with their countries of origin has by and large really centered on those remittances, those cash transfers that diasporans make back to friends and family back home. There's been a little bit of research on diasporan trade, but really less attention has been paid to what I think is even a more exciting issue, which is really diaspora investment, foreign direct investment, as well as investments that diasporans can also make in other types of more portfolio investment vehicles back in their home countries. And this is, I think, a very relevant issue for today's day because so many of the emerging markets that now garner so much attention in world press, really in many ways, in critical stages of their economic development, diaspora direct investment played a very large role, formative role in their economic development. But not just for China and India is diaspora investment important. Increasingly, countries that are smaller, that face structural and institutional challenges may not be as attractive or competitive to non-diaspora investors, but still may be very attractive as investment destinations for diasporan capital. As I mentioned, there are many different ways to sort of conceive of diaspora investment. Everything from a diasporan setting up manufacturing facilities, service-based operations, even purchasing real estate for rental or resale purposes, but also more portfolio types of investments where there's sort of less direct ownership and control involved. Things like countries have offered diaspora-specific bond issues, like Israel. For example, India from time to time has done that. Many other governments are considering doing the same. Diasporans also invest in venture capital or equity types of funds. Increasingly, there are ethnic or diasporan types of funds that are being used as lending vehicles where money is lent out to small and medium-sized enterprises back in countries of origin, sometimes at market value, but other times at below market value or even lower than or no interest rates at all, almost like a sort of a lending model that's almost charity-based types of situations. What I really want to sort of bring down, though, that sort of abstract discussion to a specific individual. This is Seth Loku. It's an individual that I met in the Netherlands and doing some research with a business incubator named IntEnt that some of you may be familiar with that focuses its business incubation activities on migrants who want to go back to their home countries and start a business. Seth, for example, was born in Ghana. He married a Dutch woman, came to the Netherlands for his education. He started working with Mobil Oil and became an executive there. But he said the whole time he was working there, he really wanted to go back to his home country and do something for development. And in fact, he's begun a biofuel business, taking a particular seed that's common in Ghana and turning it into oil, some of which is sold locally, but also exported back to the Netherlands. This is an interesting quote. This sort of summarizes his motivation. He says, "I am Dutch, but I'd like to go back to my country as a Ghanaian, so to speak, to help my country." What's interesting, I think, about diasporan investors is that they are very different than sort of the typical profile of what we consider foreign direct investors. Typically, when we think of a foreign direct investor, we often envisage a multinational corporation, or at least a very large, at least medium-sized organization that typically knows maybe very little about that country, particularly about the nuances of operating in that country, probably doesn't have many social connections within that country. And the locus of really the activity is really a headquarters, kind of subsidiary-like relationship into the investment. But a diaspora investor is often quite different in profile. Based on research that we and others have conducted, the motivations are a little bit different. They're a mix between pecuniary financial motivations, wanting to make a profit, but but also this idea that they want to, like Seth, go back to their home countries and make a difference. They get an emotional return out of the investment. And in some cases, by virtue of making these investments, they may also rise in social status within their local diasporan communities, to the extent to which the diasporan communities deem this type of investment socially desirable. They also, to the extent to which they have social network connections back in the country of origin, also might rise in their sort of social status in the origin country by making these investments. So the motivation for investment is different. Many diasporan investors aren't working within large multinational companies, although some do actually, and are key drivers in the investment decision-making process within multinationals to bring those companies to a company. For example, Ernst & Young actually set up operations in Ethiopia not too long ago, largely in response to an Ethiopian diaspora member who was a partner who really was committed to bringing presence of the company there. But by and large, diaspora investment is more micro or even small to medium size investment. In many cases, these diasporans are making very first time investment moves internationally, and therefore often need a lot more time and attention and incubation in of itself to bring those investment ideas to fruition. In some cases, these are migrants that are returning back home to resettle and start this business, but in many, many cases, these are circular migrants. Migrants who are spending some time in the country of origin and some time in a country of settlement running the business. One of the reasons why governments are increasingly interested in diaspora investment is because they believe it might offer something better than your sort of typical foreign direct investment. There is a so-called dark side of foreign direct investment that many policymakers and scholars have recognized. Often foreign investment crowds out local businesses in both financial, in input markets, and so on. But there are some ideas and beliefs, at least, around this idea that diaspora investment might be qualitatively better on several dimensions. First, compared to non-diaspora investment, many diasporans are more likely to leave their money in the country at a time of political or economic instability. Second, diaspora investors also are more likely, or at least believed to be more likely, to reinvest profits locally as opposed to simply repatriating them back out to a headquarters. Third, diaspora investors often are more interested in setting up greenfield operations, brand new factories, for example, out of scratch, as opposed to simply acquiring existing businesses. By setting up greenfield businesses, they therefore sort of add to the employment base of the country. And lastly, diaspora investors also seem to prefer to purchase their inputs locally, as the idea of sort of developing the local supply chain, as well as hiring locals to work within the organization as opposed to bringing them from abroad. There are other development benefits to diaspora investment, including the fact that diasporans also, because of these more emotional and social interests in the investment process, are more likely to set up socially responsible or environmentally responsible business practices in their operations in the country of origin. They create social capital linkages often between folks that they know in countries of settlement as well as in the countries of origin, and thereby helping other businesses, including especially some of their suppliers, become international for the first time, helping make some of those important cross-border connections. And lastly, because again of these sort of social and emotional reasons, many diaspora investors spend considerable amounts of time investing in local human capital in their businesses. Now, if diaspora investment is so great, then what can governments do? What role can they play in order to bring about diaspora investment in their country? For a report that my colleague and I did for the United Nations on this topic, we really came down to sort of two major activity sets that governments are involved in, national governments, as well as state and more local agencies are engaged in order to attract and facilitate diaspora investment. Governments can first nurture and embed diasporan investors within their local community through a variety of activities. They also can nurture a feeling of connectedness or belongingness to that home country. What I'd like to do next is just very, very briefly, this paper is actually included in full text in your CD materials. but just touch on a couple of the highlights of what are the specific challenges that diaspora investors face, what roles can governments do, and very briefly, some of the examples of those activities. One of the major challenges that diasporans face is that they typically have a lack of information about market or operational norms and difficulty navigating red tape. Where this is true for many investors, this is particularly important for diaspora investors who might be first time, again, navigating that internationalization process and who may have spent considerable amounts of time away from their country of origin. Governments can fill in for those types of challenges by conducting syndicated market research, for example, consumer and organizational market research, providing information about the investment procedures and so on in the country. And we have investment promotion agencies in many countries playing these roles, or governments themselves hosting convening events where they transfer this information. Another challenge that diasporans face is that they have difficulty identifying knowledgeable and trustworthy, reliable contacts within the country. Governments can play a role here too by hosting network databases, sponsoring networking events, publishing success stories, for example. Jamaica is, for example, engaged, we'll hear later from the Consul General about this, in a very interesting database project to do exactly this. The Afghan American Chamber of Commerce actually hosts a matchmaking conference, bringing together buyers and sellers from countries of origin and countries of settlement. There are many examples of this. In terms of cultivating feelings of belongingness, one of the major challenges governments face is how do you nurture those social and emotional reasons that may be very critical in the investment decision-making process, as well as those that are financial motivations for investment. They can offer specific incentives for diaspora-owned businesses and find ways to emphasize the non-pecuniary investment benefits of investing in the home country. Many countries, for example, often offer things like China and India do about tax breaks, providing first priority in export processing zones. Some countries like Morocco have actually engaged in full-scale marketing promotion campaigns trying to enhance the country of origin image that the country has in diasporans' mind and create the sense of duty of coming back to your home country for investment. In some cases, diasporans have a lot of fears about going back and to what degree their property rights might be protected and so on. And various different governments have dealt with this at various different types of levels in terms of extending voting rights, all the way down to at least being able to encourage diasporans to play a more policy advocating type of role in their country. So in some cases, you have polls that are offered in embassies for voting. Whole legislative seats have often in some countries been dedicated to the diaspora. But in other cases, we see things like in India and Ethiopia, where there's a specific type of visa status class given to those who live, persons of that type of ethnic origin or national origin living outside the country. I lead a research team at George Washington University that's very interested in studying this phenomenon more in depth. It's called the Diaspora Capital Investment Project. And around this issue, we're asking several different types of questions because there's still so much that we need to know and catalog about this. As I mentioned, this idea about diaspora investment is a relatively new one in the field. So we have questions about not just what drives investment, this investment interest, but also what can governments do to more effectively market to their diaspora and communities for investment. What are the necessary facilitating institutions? What roles, for example, can diaspora organizations or incubators or other government agencies play in facilitating and promoting this type of investment? But also specifically, getting more empirical and scientific data on, is this diaspora investment really qualitatively better than non-diaspora investment? And what are the impacts on economies and societies of diaspora investment? So a very brief tour around the exciting world of diaspora investment, but I look forward to your questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the Nordic Africa Institute and Fatu in particular for inviting us today. Unlike my colleagues, I'm a little less organized. I don't have a PowerPoint, which probably explains why They are the co-directors of our initiative, and I am not. But I do have a white paper that this is drawing off of today, and I would be glad to make that available to anybody who wishes, especially if I don't get quite through all the points that I would like to. I'd like to move a little bit from the more general concerns that were talked about to the more specific, and look at the case of the role of diasporas in war-torn countries. And I'll be drawing off my own research in different war-torn countries, most recently Liberia, but also as a core researcher for the last 10 years for the Humanitarianism and War Project. And as many of you know, humanitarian and post-conflict aid is typically thought of as involving two sets of actors, these being the international community and purely local actors. Today I want to examine the potential of a hitherto unexamined third humanitarian space that really remains fairly unconsidered and unaccounted for in humanitarian and post-conflict reconstruction making. More specifically, I want to discuss how diasporic involvement in international humanitarian and reconstruction work may contribute to addressing some of the most serious problems that persistently plague international aid efforts. And I'd also like to outline some of the challenges and perils that greater diasporic involvement in humanitarian enterprises can engender. Now, over the last decade, the field of humanitarian studies and post-conflict aid has experienced persistent and deepening malaise, particularly, though not exclusively, in African theaters of activity. Spectacular public failures in which beneficiaries were neither assisted or even further harmed by international relief efforts have forced the humanitarian community to question the meaning and the effects of its activities, even as they've also been forced to the scrutiny by diminishing foreign assistance budgets and growing donor fatigue. And this has given rise to an explosion of assessments, a virtual evaluation cottage industry, I would describe it. In the process, certain critical shortcomings of humanitarian action have been identified by many different studies, and among these are, I will list very quickly, failures to produce sustainable results, failures to build local capacity in a deep way, failures of reach and coverage within war-torn countries, failures to meaningfully link emergency aid to post-conflict development, failures to adequately account for local, cultural, socioeconomic, and political context, and a very dramatic lack of accountability to aid recipients. These failures, I would contend, are not new. However, awareness and analysis over the last decade has really given rise to very little fundamental change. I would contend that 15 years into the proliferation of assessment and the institutionalization of humanitarian and post-conflict studies, it's not possible to claim that these problems have not been addressed due to a lack of information, consideration, or recommendation. In fact, I would say that the well-worn question of what do actors at the humanitarian table need to do differently in order to address these problems is no longer the most relevant one. We may benefit from asking new and different questions altogether, namely which new actors might be brought to this table in order to more effectively address these problems. How can, I would like to ask, the incorporation of new types of actors, and particularly diasporas, into post-conflict reconstruction and humanitarian efforts offer solutions to the intractability of the problems I briefly summarized? Now, armed conflicts have always produced displaced populations, many who are the classic targets for assistance. But another small but growing minority of those displaced in these conflicts find asylum in the more distant nations of the developed world, such as Sweden, the US, Canada, and Australia. And I will draw on some of my own work in the Liberian diaspora. For example, the best available estimates place the number of Liberians settled in the US at 70,000, with sister communities numbering in the thousands here in Sweden, in the UK, and Netherlands. Now, these diasporan groups are actually far more relevant to post-conflict reconstruction activities than their numbers alone suggest. In fact, they're often the most educated and professionally qualified members of their societies of origin, and while educational and professional opportunities have virtually disappeared for decades of war in their own societies, in the developed world, they have benefited from new educational and professional opportunities that enhance their human capital. It's therefore likely that a disproportionate amount of the human capital of many war-torn societies is embodied in the relatively small minority of populations that live in diaspora. The remittances of individual migrants have long been accounted as significant factors in the development of many migrant-sending countries. In war-torn countries like Liberia, however, this significance may be amplified. Let me give an estimate, a statistic that may be of some interest. The $26 million a year that were sent from the US to Liberia have some significance if we consider that in 2005, the government of Liberia's entire operating budget was just over 2.5 times that amount. Now, there has been actually relatively little policy consideration of the contributions that diaspora populations and organizations make to relief and reconstruction efforts in their home societies. I should highlight that we actually have one of the few people who has done that here in the room today, Dr. Cindy Horst from PRIO. So there are exceptions. There are several specific reasons why the humanitarian involvement of global diasporas of war-torn societies may help address the persistent failures that plague international humanitarian building and post-conflict reconstruction. Let me start to highlight how. First, the need for local knowledge. It's well documented that humanitarian organizations consistently fail to adequately account for and address the social, cultural, and historical differences of the varied contexts in which they work, remaining mired in a cookie-cutter mode of operation in which they transplant programs and personnel from one theater to the next. Industry leaders in humanitarian aid agree that international NGOs have successfully built expertise in areas that do not require context-specific knowledge, such as in international human rights law, accounting, logistics, etc. But contrast-specific knowledge, such as cultural norms and understandings about social organization, by their very nature require long-term immersion in and familiarity with the complexities of specific settings. It is unlikely that they will have the time or the resources to foster that knowledge. Yet indeed, time after time, it has been empirically demonstrated that many of the best-intentioned relief efforts have proven to be ineffective or even harmful to their recipients because international humanitarian actors did not account for local knowledge and had little understanding of capacities that were already on the ground. Now, diasporas represent a source of human capital, of qualified technical talent, that has really been largely untapped by international humanitarian communities. Many of these diasporan professionals are not only highly trained, there are, after all, more Liberian doctors in the city of Philadelphia than in the country of Liberia, but they also benefit from forms of human capital that international counterparts do not have, no matter how many complex emergencies they have worked in. Thus, the diasporic Liberian professional also shares more cultural background with aid recipients in his own country than any foreign technical assistant does. He or she may speak several of the local languages and know communication conventions, be knowledgeable of local and national history, and aware of the myriad social conventions and aspects of worldview, precisely those aspects of local context that international NGO leaders recognize as so vital to the success of their mission, yet claim they cannot afford to acquire. In fact, it would take years to acquire. Foreign technical assistants would have to become anthropologists. Local knowledge and ongoing social ties may be vital factors that underwrite greater aid effectiveness on the part of diasporan humanitarians when compared to their international counterparts. For example, the vast majority of diasporic aid and investment initiatives in Liberia are very small in scale, a factor that has actually led some analysts to simply dismiss their potential importance or effectiveness. However, the potential benefits of microscaling, especially in post-conflict societies, may actually deserve more careful consideration and empirical research. For example, several diasporan church leaders in Providence, Rhode Island, emphasize the importance of remaining modest in their assistance efforts in order to more effectively navigate the rampant corruption and criminality that prevailed in Liberia during the early transition period. As one church leader explained to me, it is far better to send a dozen barrels now and another dozen barrels in 6 months and then again after the holidays, or maybe just one container at a time. But if you get too ambitious and send a dozen containers at once, then you will be noticed by those who have interests. Big gestures, I quote, make big targets. Now, such nuanced assessments of local reality cast some critical light on the international community's default interest in always seeking to scale up, and may suggest the political merits of scaling down. Now, local knowledge may also play a vital role in enabling diasporan humanitarians to pursue solutions that are more locally appropriate and sustainable. A real-life example, again from the Liberian diaspora. In 2006, an individual from the Liberian diaspora, I'm going to call him Edward, worked 3 different jobs as a waiter in Washington, D.C. He went to visit relatives in a very remote part of Liberia that required several days of journey by car, by boat, and by foot. Sounds like Planes, Trains, and Automobile, the movie. Because bridges and roads had been destroyed by the war. During his visit, it became clear that the greatest need of the village stemmed from its problems with lack of outside access. Primarily because the old road had been mined and 3 small bridges destroyed. With a contribution of $800 US, this individual provided the villagers with tools and resources they needed to clear a new road and build 3 rudimentary bridges over streams that would allow a 4-wheel vehicle to reach the community. Indeed, when Edward visited the following year, he was able to hire a car that took him all the way to the village itself in considerably less time than his first trip. Other things, aspects of this. I want to note simply that these bridges that Edward was able to fund for his hometown would likely be regarded as thoroughly inadequate by an international NGO or their donors. And yet it was built with local materials and know-how that ensure that for the foreseeable future can be easily repaired and maintained by the community itself without additional external inputs. Indeed, the scale of his initiative was so small that it would be highly unlikely to ever make sense as a viable project for an international NGO. Let me move to a second issue, the need for more sustainable results. Now, despite several notable efforts to ensure that international relief efforts contribute to longer-term post-conflict development, by most accounts, the ability of international relief efforts to provide a basis for longer-term development has been highly limited. There is little incentive in the international community to consider the longer-term effects that may result from, in part because the humanitarian community is never around long enough in the long term to witness what those consequences are. Pure relief activity itself has proven difficult for international NGOs to sustain throughout clearly still emergency phases. International humanitarian activity is particularly likely to wane when emergency conditions persist over years or decades as a result of conflicts that become long-term or chronically resurgent and donor fatigue sets in. Now, again, the difference in the types of stakes that diasporas and international humanitarians have is important to consider. International humanitarian organizations are defined by their stake in a condition, that of complex emergency. This is very different from the stake that diasporas have. An illustrative analogy can be drawn to the different types of concerns that are likely to animate the shareholders of an embattled firm and the lawyers who are hired to defend it. While the lawyer is interested in defending the firm from an immediate threat, such as a lawsuit, he or she has no vested interest in how this particular strategy affects the productivity, or health of the firm itself. Now, arguably, international humanitarian organizations have stakes that are comparable to this one's. Diasporas, on the other hand, are more comparable to shareholders in a firm. While they are most certainly interested in solving immediate crisis in their homelands, their ultimate investment is far more likely to be and depend upon its ultimate health. Sustainable research results. Research is already providing some evidence that an incentive structure that is responsive to kinship ties and membership in the society being assisted will differentiate diasporan initiatives from international efforts in several crucial ways. Diasporas will operate with longer time horizons, have higher risk thresholds, and have an interest in social returns that may be more important than financial or donor relation returns, as many diasporan in post-conflict contexts. Another difference, coverage. Inasmuch as social connections play a significant role in determining where within war-torn societies diasporans choose to pursue their initiatives, diasporan aid is more likely to have greater social reach and potentially provide more comprehensive coverage than international actors provide. Now, even though humanitarian agencies are officially in the business of identifying and mitigating need, the actual practice of the enterprise has a tendency to respond first and foremost to other taskmasters, such as political proclivities of donors, staff safety considerations, and marketplace competition that implicitly skews organizations to consider the doable than that which needs to be done. Thus, not unlike most post-conflict contexts, any comparison of a map of need with a map of aid provided shows significant disparities, with humanitarian organizations heavily concentrated in areas of more easy access. Yet high risk or inaccessible and logistically challenging areas may still attract the attention of diasporans such as Edward, who are drawn to such locations because of their social ties. I don't really have enough time, I think, to go over some of the other factors, but there are some very important research findings that show that the impact of diasporan organizations on capacity building is very different, in part because diasporas themselves are members of the society. To build the capacity of diasporas is, unlike building the capacity of an international NGO, to build the capacity of those organizations themselves. I also discussed the need for greater accountability to aid recipients. We live in an age where humanitarian action is accountability is a mantra, but accountability to whom is the question we need to ask. Accountability moves up the chain towards donors, but there's very little chance in what is in essence a monopoly market for aid recipients to have a voice in setting the agenda and in giving feedback on the effects of aid. Through diasporas, and I have several examples in this paper, because diasporas are members of their host societies as well, they provide a very concrete mechanism for affecting that agenda in a very real way. Now, in final conclusion, there are some perils of diasporan involvement, and we need to keep those in mind. And again, those of you interested in this, you can ask about this in the question period or look at the paper. But let me highlight what those are very quickly. One is partisanship. This is something we have to take a very careful look at, and the Liberian case is a good example of this. Cultural divergence and social distancing. To assume that diasporans, after 10 or 15 or 20 years abroad, are still one and the same as their fellow counterparts in their way of thinking is a mistaken assumption that needs to be looked at in terms of through an empirical lens. There's the possibility of agenda mixing, of humanitarian initiatives becoming the Trojan horse for political action. There's no mistake that, or there's no coincidence that I think it was 14 or 15 of the 22 presidential candidates in Liberia had NGOs that were active on the ground before the election. So to conclude, a notice by the international aid community, diasporan efforts cumulatively constitute a hitherto examined and unaccounted for third humanitarian space. It may be structurally different in very significant ways from the international post-conflict apparatus that is spearheaded by the UN and well-known international actors. Ultimately, policymakers who do not account for the growing and increasingly complex role of diasporas in post-conflict transitions of war-torn countries such as Liberia do so at their peril. They are a presence, they are active, they are doing things, and they matter. They ignore a key and often confounding piece of the political and economic puzzle, and they miss an important potential humanitarian resource that can have multiplier effects, and when harnessed in a careful and considered way that is context-specific, may provide some much-needed corrective to the humanitarian and post-conflict reconstruction enterprises. I will simply allude to the fact that we at the moment are in the process of developing 3 specific research projects that are trying to look at this comparatively and in the Liberian context, and trying to bring research into policy action streams, and be glad to discuss those with anybody who wishes to after. Thank you, and sorry for going over 2 minutes.
Thank you very much for, again, a very interesting and we have the PowerPoint.
Thank you very much. This is a new version, so I'm not sure how to use it. It's really a thrill to be here today, and my colleagues have already foreshadowed some really important issues. It's a little intimidating to follow such a tour de force on business and the role of diasporas in conflict and post-conflict reconstruction. But I'm going to take more of a generalist perspective. I sit in a school of public policy and public administration, and my background is in international development administration. And so I'm primarily concerned with how can we facilitate these very important contributions. And so I'll be speaking today about creating an enabling environment for diaspora participation. And I'm going to, what did I do here? Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about some of the inputs that diasporas bring, and then I will speak more specifically to the enabling environment. So we've heard some of this already. We know that some of the most prominent contributions that diasporas make are through remittances, and Steve gave a very powerful example from Liberia and post-conflict reconstruction, but we know that remittances are one of the areas that get the most attention in terms of diaspora contributions to the homeland, often making considerable contributions in terms of a country's GDP, for example, and that they tend to be counter-cyclical. And so in the current economic crisis, remittances are all the more important to many of these countries. We know that diasporas play a very important role in philanthropy in their home countries, and this can extend to full-on development projects as well as more one-off kinds of events, sponsoring schools, training, etc. Knowledge transfer is a very important role also. We heard from Liesl already about investment in business development, and also one of the major contributions that diasporas can make are through policy influence, for better or for worse, but often very much for the better. Sometimes diasporas, precisely because of their engagement in the homeland for development purposes, will lobby that homeland government for an improved enabling environment for foreign direct investment as well as other activities. So let's talk a little bit about why these contributions occur. And again, Professor Riddle already went through some of this. Some of the incentives for why an individual diasporan or a diaspora organization would want to engage in development vis-a-vis the homeland are simply to express one's identity, perhaps because of cultural obligations, because they retain strong ties with their homeland, maybe purely from a sense of altruism, but also accessing resources. And this is an element that is sometimes exaggerated, sometimes ignored, depending on one's particular ideological perspective on the phenomenon. So there are 5 power resources that we can talk about that diasporans may be seeking to access. Economic is the one that is most familiar to us, but also social resources. This refers to social status that's based on social roles or on complying with socially valued criteria. So they can gain status in their communities, both in the receiving country as well as in the homeland, through the activities that they engage in. Political resources, and Steve gave a very interesting example of that from Liberia. And finally, moral resources. This is the perceived legitimacy of their actions. And finally, informational resources that they seek to access through their work. Homeland government policy options have been categorized in these 3 broad areas. First of them is remittance capture, and Liesl gave some examples of that earlier in terms of trying to set up, for example, diaspora remittance bonds and other investment opportunities to capture the economic resources that diasporas have. Sometimes it's simply trying to formalize these transfers into the banking system. And a colleague of ours, Natasha Iskander at New York University, has done some very interesting long-term work looking at the case of Morocco and how the Moroccan government, for example, established a long-term relationship with its banks through the diaspora. And diaspora networking is about linking the needs of the country to the diaspora and its resources. And there are a range of different activities that can be done. So this might be providing incentives, it might be through newsletters and databases and other informational resources. And finally, diaspora integration. This strategy recognizes the diaspora as a constituency, a political constituency outside of the country, so that these diasporans are viewed still as being part of the country. Certain policies might include, for example, extending citizenship rights or other specific benefits to diasporas in the homeland. So let me talk a little bit about then what are some of the principal roles that government can play and how this can play out in terms of establishing an enabling environment for diaspora's contribution to development. And here I draw on some earlier work by my husband, Derek Brinkerhoff, who was looking at an enabling environment for NGOs in achieving the Millennium Development Goals. So I've adapted his original framework to look specifically at the role of diasporas. First of all, we know that one of the major roles that government plays is mandating, and this is done typically through legal frameworks. We pass laws that require or prohibit certain things. So the locus within governments for the mandating role is typically Parliament and the judiciary. Another enabling role that governments play is facilitating. Here, governments may provide the kinds of incentives I was talking about earlier, informational resources, structures, and mechanisms. These types of activities tend to be based in government leadership, for example, in president's offices, in embassies, in specialized and technical ministries. So you may have a ministry of diaspora, or it may be occurring through a ministry of health, for example. Another role is resourcing. And here, this refers obviously to government's role in actually providing some financial or other resources, maybe it's resources in kind, to support the activities of diasporas and development. This may occur through the Ministry of Finance, or again, through the technical ministries or specialized ministries and initiatives. A more elaborate role that governments might play is in actually partnering. This is a more formal arrangement that is usually a case-by-case kind of basis, where a government agency or initiative might partner with a diaspora organization and maybe even an international organization. So for example, the International Organization for Migration has a partnership that links the Ghanaian diaspora in the Netherlands to the Ministry of Health in Ghana to try to facilitate knowledge transfer in the medical field. This tends to be based, again, in technical ministries, specialized ministries, and specialized initiatives. A very important role that government also plays that is often ignored is the endorsing role. This is the role where government is acknowledging these contributions and holding them up as something very important and valued to the country. This locus is in embassies, specialized ministries and initiatives, and again, technical ministries. Now, I know from the participation list for today's event that we have a lot of embassy personnel in the audience today, so I wanted to specifically highlight where your role might be. There is a significant amount of things that embassies can do to facilitate diaspora's contribution to development, and we will be hearing a couple of very interesting examples from Mexico and Jamaica in the next session, but I wanted to highlight this. So let me speak specifically to the comparative advantage of embassies. First of all, this is primarily in the area of diaspora networking and integration. This is where the diaspora can be linked back to the homeland with the embassy as an intermediary that can provide this kind of social resources, information, and moral power that I talked about earlier. Facilitative actions include diplomacy to ensure diasporans' security of residence and recognition of homeland credentials. This is a very important function that embassies can play. Without security of residence, diasporans may be less likely to travel back and forth to the homeland to make contributions, and their resources may be limited if their credentials are not recognized. So there's an important advocacy role that embassies can play to empower diasporans. They can also maintain databases of diasporas and diaspora organizations so that it's more clear who the government, the homeland government, as well as the receiving government should be interfacing with when they want to consult with the diaspora. Diaspora-oriented websites and newsletters are very important for providing information about home country needs and priorities, but also demystifying policies and budgets. So playing somewhat of an educational role to the diaspora so that they have a better understanding of the policy environment in both the homeland and the receiving country. Also, embassies can facilitate diplomatic visits, and this is at a marginal cost when there are already diplomatic visits underway that we can also suggest that these meetings take place with diasporas. Providing access to policymakers when they do come to visit, organizing specific diaspora summits, and supporting diaspora organization and business capacity building. Endorsing actions, again, to publicize to the diaspora the importance of each one of the contributions that they make to the homeland development. Summits and diplomatic delegations that recognize and praise the contributions. Awards competitions, this is very important for the endorsing function and other forms of recognition. And finally, to encourage media reporting, tell the story and advertise, publicize these stories. In terms of strategic prioritization for the homeland governments themselves, I have a whole paper that this is based on that is on the CDs and forthcoming in the journal International Migration, and it contains a couple of tables that outline a whole framework for all the different things that can be done, and it's a bit overwhelming. And so one of the initial responses was, well, with all this great roadmap and this great information, what should governments do first? And so here's some suggestions. First of all, focusing on the mandating role. This is relatively low cost because it doesn't concern creating whole new administrations or bureaucracies. Diaspora outreach, as I mentioned before, can be an incremental cost when they already are doing diplomatic visits to add diaspora activities to the agenda. And partnering with receiving societies to try to advocate for capacity building, technical assistance, and the creation of new structures and initiatives. I know we also have international donors in our audience, so I wanted to focus also on what international donors can do about creating this enabling environment. First of all, a very important function is government capacity building. This is a very ambitious agenda when you think about the range of the policies that could be put into place. And the donors can play an important role in trying to promote policy coherence as well as capacity building to support it. They can also support diasporas in terms of capacity building and building the capacity of other intermediaries, and include diasporas in development consultations and needs assessments, and we'll hear more about that. As with Steve, I wanted to end with an important point, which this should not be all diaspora all the time, that in fact there are some caveats to this framework. We know that there are political situations where perhaps we don't want to enable the contributions of diasporas to development or other activities. We know that diaspora's contributions are not always inclusive or coherent, and so we cannot rely solely on them, and we need to be aware that sometimes they may introduce some inequities in local communities. Also, diasporas are another stakeholder and should not necessarily be viewed as a privileged agent. Their contributions, even though they're bringing money, should perhaps not displace the importance of local citizens and their desires for their community. And finally, many people have heard me say this before, it's one of my favorite mantras, that we should target the mobilized. And by that I mean that sometimes in the enthusiasm surrounding the potential of diasporas, we think about the need to mobilize diasporas and tap their resources rather than identifying those diaspora individuals and groups who are already mobilized and who already perceive the incentives that I outlined earlier. Thank you very much.